So, Josh, we had a really interesting summer, and I know you're a father of two young kids and an older son. How did that impact your life
Just what happened with
with,
the
with George
with
Floyd
George
and the
Floyd.
climate of everything that's going on?
Well, I was disgusted by it, and I'm a former prosecutor as well, so it was unbelievable to me watching it, and I've shown parts of it to my kids and talked to them about it, and I mean brought up race issues with them, and just had those conversations because I think we live in a bubble. We live in a bubble, and they don't understand that.
I guess for me, it was painful. More so is because I remember the stories that my grandparents told me as a child dealing with civil rights. My grandfather has met Malcolm. Um, he's spoken to him. He's had a relationship with him, and hearing those stories of life in New York, and my grandfather being a retired AME pastor, going through all over the country, building churches, dealing with his own issues of racism, and then hearing the story of my mom. She couldn't go to her senior prom because in Chambersburg, Pennsylvania, a white guy asked her to the prom, and my grandmother wouldn't let her go due to the climate. And then I go back to my life. I grew up right here in Gulfport, Florida. Gulfport, my grandparents were the first blacks to live there. And at one time, black people couldn't go across 49th Street. If you went across 49th, you need to be back across before dark because you would get chased. And my own story of dealing with racism in that area, I mean, growing up, predominantly all my friends were white. So to see that, and then my kids have to see this man get killed on television,
Right.
it's traumatic. And then how do you have that conversation of saying it's going to get better when that same conversation my grandparents told
Right.
me it was going to get better? It's tough, but it's also I'm thankful. The climate that we're living in right now, this country, everybody was up in arms with President Trump. And quite honestly, I'm thankful to President Trump. And I know it's kind of odd coming from a black man to say that, but for the longest, black people have been speaking about injustice, 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 and everyone is like, no, it's not. Slavery's over. But
Right.
then when they see it in action from Trump's quote unquote followers and racism, now it's like, oh, and now the world is listening because you've had more white people talk about the injustices of black people, whereas just 5-6 years ago it was like, you guys are crazy. You have rights, you have freedom, so what are you talking about?
Right. No, I mean, I agree with you on that. Now it's really out in the open. But I mean, what you're saying, that the story, like what you lived, is important to tell. And I mean, I'll tell my kids about this conversation because them seeing that, they can see it's wrong, but they don't have the background. They haven't lived it. They don't have the grandparents that you have, or that you've lived it. But I think we have to tell them what's happened. These individual cases, and let them know. Like, growing up in St. Pete, there's that hot dog stand right on Ninth Ave, and there's the brick side, and you can tell it used to be a window. When I drive by there, I'll tell my kids, that's where the minorities had to go to get their hot dogs. They weren't allowed to go inside. And that wasn't that long ago. I
No.
mean, that was, I mean, it wasn't when I was down here, but it wasn't centuries ago. But and kids this age, they have difficulty understanding 10 to 20 years versus 100 years.
Right.
We got to get past that. And I mean, I'm not an educator like your wife. I mean, I know there's methods to do that. I don't know what those methods are yet. I'm still learning. Being a
I think we just have to continue to just be honest with ourselves and be honest with our kids. These kids are so advanced now compared to our time of growing up, where we was happy with some sheets outside making a fort. These kids have so many tools to garner information so quickly. It's just like, just be direct and honest with them. I feel I had to do it with my 8-year-old daughter who she couldn't understand, and she couldn't articulate her feelings, so she kind of broke down. But I had to explain to her racism, and not all white people hate us, because that was one of her questions, like why are they hate us so bad, and that's not the case. And we have to make sure we balance it out on how we educate our kids. We don't hate each other and we don't want to fight each other, but there is an injustice to a certain group of people, and we cannot dismiss that injustice.
Right. Yeah. No, and it's these individual personal stories, I think, that really hit hard. Like my son gets baseball lessons with the Dominican, and his dad, everyone calls him Chicken. And my son, he was telling me, well, why do they call him Chicken? Well, when they would go to restaurants, he wasn't allowed to go in. So, and he's in front of he's in front of my son. So he's, his 60s, 70s. And they said Chicken because that's, he had an accent. He's like, just get me chicken. So all the other baseball players, that was his nickname, was Chicken. But something like that hit my son. Like I could see at 12 years old, that registered with him, because he can see it's the father of his baseball coach. He can see him, and he's talked to him, and he says, man, he didn't used to be able to go into a restaurant. This guy right in front of me. And those are the things that I think really register. I think the George Floyd thing registers for people that have lived through it like you, but it's more difficult for me to portray that to my kids, other than seeing that it's a wrong. They don't really understand why it's so wrong, because of the difference in color and all the background. They understand it's wrong, but I think we just need the individual background stories, like like what you're saying with your grandfather. Yeah. And going across 49th Street.
Yeah.
I mean that's important to these children understand. And I mean we learn from history, right? We learn from our past mistakes, and that's why it's important.